Excellent. So we have folks joining us in progress. I'm going to. Excellent. So I would like to welcome you all to the final program of the Orange County African American Historical Society's month-long celebration of Juneteenth for 2022. We have had an amazing series of discussions, all of which have been recorded and put up online at ocaahs.org. And if you go to ocaahs.org/events, it can take you right to the recordings, or they're at the bottom of the homepage. So you can feel free to catch up on anything you've missed, but I am really excited.
Is it possible that there's a different link to get in? Because when I joined the last time I was part of the panel, it didn't show up as me being a registered person to participate. And that's what it did this time. It said, are you registered to join, and blah, 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 blah. So I don't know. I can't figure this out by myself.
Okay, so you still can't hear us, Zann? So we've got the audience in right now. So Zann, I don't think can hear us right now. So we're gonna kind of do a little troubleshooting with her, because we can hear her, but she can't hear us right now. So we are, you've got the president of the Emmanuel Dabney
Can
fan
you
club.
possibly send me a link?
Yes, Zann, I can send you a link.
Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to participate in the panel.
Great. So to kind of continue on with what we were setting up, we are joined by an amazing set of panelists today, one of which, as you can hear, is having some audio difficulties. So we are going to just real quick try to get her sorted out and get her audio sorted out. So I am going to send something to her really quickly, and hopefully this will get it all sorted out for her. You know, the joy of doing these things live. So just one second. There we go. Oh, there's also a Shelley Murphy fangirl in the audience. So we've got a really.
I was wondering if I knew that Annie Evans. I asked you earlier, and I said, I wonder if that's Annie Evans from Fluvanna.
Well,
Annie.
We're really excited for our program today, and hopefully, while Zann gets her audio worked out, we can talk a little bit about what the programs are going to be, and just to let everyone know. As I mentioned, this has been part of a virtual series, part of our homecoming celebration. And this year for 2022, our theme has been Juneteenth, a homecoming celebration. So we've really embraced these ideas of coming home, homecoming, talked a lot about what Juneteenth means. We've talked a lot about African American history and culture. And we've really explored a lot of areas. And I wanted to take this celebration past June and into July. I said it was a month-long celebration, but we went a little overboard because this idea of celebrating 2 Independence Days, 2 holidays of freedom about a month apart or less, just really struck me as something, this idea of a summer that celebrates freedom and independence in 2 very different ways. And coming off the heels of the 4th of July, I thought, what better conversation to have than a conversation about African Americans in the military throughout the history. So we put together this really amazing panel. I'm going to introduce them all now, and hopefully by the time introductions are done, Zann will be back with us, and her sound will be working properly. But let me go through the introductions. So our panelists with the fan clubs, we'll start with, we're joined today by Emmanuel Dabney. He has been employed by the National Park Service at Petersburg National Battlefield since 2001. After completing high school school in Dinwiddie County. Emmanuel graduated magna cum laude with an Associates of Arts from Richard Bland College, and then graduated magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in Historic Preservation from the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg. He completed his master's degree in public history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and he has given many programs on the issues facing African Americans in antebellum wartime and the immediate post-war America, as well as how to represent these experiences within professional museum settings. Emmanuel has delivered programs on various Civil War roundtables, museums, colleges, and other organizations. And like some of the stuff he's going to bring up tonight, his family tree is complicated. Among his Dinwiddie County ancestors, his maternal line is his great-great-great-grandfather was a wealthy Virginia slave owner, and his great-great-great-grandmother was a mixed-race free Black woman. And another great-great-great-grandfather was enslaved in Dinwiddie. His paternal line, furthest back ancestors were enslaved people from North Carolina, and included in his family tree are 2 members of the Virginia Secession Convention, numerous Confederate soldiers and officers, and his great-grandfather, Henry Dabney, was digging earthworks around Petersburg in 1864 and 65. So we're really excited to have Emmanuel here. We're also joined by Dr. Shelley Murphy. Dr. Murphy is the Descendant Project Researcher for the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Virginia. Her background spans with nonprofit and local government work focused primarily on real estate, affordable housing, and fair housing discrimination issues. An avid genealogist for over 30 years, Dr. Murphy, AKA the Family Tree Girl, which is one of my favorite nicknames, was born and raised in Michigan and is now living in Central Virginia. She conducts genealogical workshops at local, state, and national conferences. She's known for her inspiring and interactive "So What?" with the genealogical research, along with interesting problem-solving methodology lectures, such as the use of timelines. Murphy is also the coordinator and instructor for the Midwestern African American Genealogical Institute, MAAGI, and serves on the board of Libraries of Virginia, Albemarle, Charlottesville, and Fluvanna Historical Societies. She's the president, coordinator, and instructor at the Midwest African American Genealogical Institute, and has developed educational programs for the Center for Family History at the IAAM. She holds memberships in the AAHGS, NGS, APG, DAR, and local genealogical groups. Dr. Murphy's personal research focuses on Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Virginia, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And hopefully, if her sound gets working, we will also be joined by Zann Nelson. Zann is a historical investigator, writer, and advocate. Her academic and instructional background includes a bachelor's degree with a concentration in peace and conflict studies from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where she graduated summa cum laude, a graduate certificate in nonprofit management from Georgetown University, and a Virginia Supreme Court certification as a trained mediator. Her experiential background includes 40 plus years as an advocate for social bridge building and reconciliation, a cache of over 700 published columns, featured articles, and journal chapters focused on African American history, and as a descendant ancestor-based research involving the domestic slave trade. Her recent collaborative achievements, including spearheading the passage of SJR 297 in the 2019 Virginia Assembly, a landmark resolution apologizing for lynching in Virginia, and receiving the 2020 the AAHGS National Distinguished Service Award. She currently serves on the Virginia History of Lynching Workshop Group, which is part of the MLK Commission, and she's the vice president of the Orange County African American Historical Society. And she also coordinated our in-person celebration this year for Juneteenth. So I really appreciate Zann's work, both for the in-person celebration as well as for our online celebration. So I am just going to double check really quickly. Has Zann been able to rejoin us? Are you on here? No, Shelley, I see you nodding your head now.
I don't see her.
All right. So while hopefully she'll be back online with us soon, but we'll go ahead and get started and talk about some of the questions that we had lined up. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the panel, kind of starting with this idea that we talked about in the introduction of, we just celebrated these two holidays dedicated to freedom, Juneteenth and July 4th. And a lot of the celebration of particularly the 4th of July is this idea of folks who have fought for our freedom. And I'm going to start with you, Shelley. How have African Americans been part of that fight for freedom? I know that's a huge question, but why don't you kick us off?
Well, for one thing, I don't know, and I'm going to say I'm young, even though I just celebrated a good birthday, but I don't know of any conflict, war, or any type thing like that African Americans have not been a part of for this country, be it British America, be it, the United States of America. And definitely if we start with the American Revolution, they definitely were there. And pretty much, I think the count is almost 7,000 now. That's African Americans and American Indians. So definitely been part of it. And we even had a great roll of folks that were here from Central Virginia that was part, of the Revolutionary War, providing either a service. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about the ones that have been acknowledged by the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution, who they deemed as a patriot. So I imagine there's even more.
Absolutely. Emmanuel, I'm going to go to you. Same question.
I'm glad that what was just said was said, because it's true that since 1493, there have been Africans that have somehow or another, willing and unwilling, and the majority were unwilling, crossing into this hemisphere. And for the work in which I do professionally and personally, Black Civil War soldiers are, a key element to this country's survival. In 1861, the United States was broken. It had been broken for a while politically. And these early efforts, early in the Civil War, in 1861, we see Black men offering service to the United States to save the nation. And I say this a lot of times, it is at times difficult to imagine people who have been oppressed from the onslaught, the oncoming of the country's founding. I say this all the time in my personal life, that this country cannot deal with its racial problems until we recognize that the foundation of it was built on white supremacy. But for Black folk, we have always been there to offer our assistance in whatever way. For tonight's discussion, military service. In 1861, Black men are offering military service to a nation that had spent a considerable amount of effort and energy to retain and maintain the institution of slavery. And so for Black people to say, there's a moment where we can join in this fight and preserve the Union and make it a better Union, those early offers were no, at least not in the Army. The US Navy, very different story.
Yeah.
The Navy sort of took anybody, anywhere, they put in a port somewhere in the, India, they take you. But the Army, very resistant. It had been legally forbidden for Black men to join in the armies, and since really the Militia Act in 1793. And so there's no shift in that in 1861. But as the war goes on in 1862, and more Black people, are men, women, and children of all different ages, are fleeing behind Union lines. The US government has to do something with all these people because they need shelter and food and protection, and they're not, the government decides through a series of actions to not send these people back to the people that had once enslaved them. And in 1862, we see early, not sanctioned by the US War Department, efforts to recruit Black military regiments on land. But certainly in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we have a whole bureau established to create these United States Colored Troop regiments. And these ultimately, around 180,000 Black men in the US Army are going to preserve the Union, which was not clear if that was going to happen even in 1863. And through their military service, will change the Union from a slaveholding nation to one that will ultimately, by the end of 1865, pass a new amendment to the Constitution eradicating slavery.
Zann, and I know you weren't exactly able to hear the question, but just sort of a general, how have African Americans been involved in the fights for freedom, sort of in the history of the country?
Well, I've been working on something because of the holiday. It brings everything to the forefront. And I know tonight's talk is about heroes in the military, and we will focus on that. But you brought up in your question about Juneteenth and July 4th. And I think this nation needs to think more deeply about the question of freedom. Because granted, with Juneteenth, the African Americans who were formerly enslaved got one piece of that freedom. They got the freedom that they could no longer be legally enslaved unless they were prisoners. But thinking about that, there's so many other freedoms that we haven't had. And I see, frankly, a lot of history in the African-American culture that from emancipation forward has been fighting for freedom, even if it's not in the military. And I know we're focused on the military tonight, but I think as a nation, we need to think about those other things, whether it's civil rights movements or it's standing up against oppression. There's so many different ways to fight for and sustain freedom, whether we celebrate it through July 4th or we celebrate it through Juneteenth. So that's my, I mean, what Shelley and Emmanuel stated, I really can't add to militarily.
I think that that's a really great point, Zann, though, that this is so much bigger. And I think it shows how interconnected, even having a conversation once a week, every day for a month, and we've just begun to scratch the surface of exactly what you're talking about. So thank you so much for that.
Well, Mary, you know, another thing we celebrate Juneteenth nationwide pretty much, but we're forgetting it wasn't June 19, that was Texas. Let's not forget December in Delaware. And that's like a little quiet thing up in the north that, you know, that the freedom wasn't given until then. And it's almost like that was the final, to me, the final time frame when, you know, people were really free nationwide. I'll say nationwide, but, you know, not just June 19th. They got to take it all the way to December in Delaware and the revised amendment and this and the others. So I think we should be celebrating from June to December. You know, it's almost an everyday thing. And I'm following into what, you know, Zann is saying about these other freedoms. But again, we still had people enslaved through the end of that year. And another perspective is, and again, for most of us that are here, pretty much all of us do research, there's still some enslavement in some form that people of color are still going through in 2022. And we see those fighting for the civil rights or whatever it might be. So the struggle just continues, you know, and I'm looking forward that and proud that they actually acknowledge Juneteenth even more. And, like the Tulsa Massacre and all of these things. And I'm going to come back to the military for a moment. There's so much people don't know. I mean, I'm tapping into Justice Central Virginia folks that provided a service. And when I say Central Virginia, just put any of the counties close to, say, around the city of Charlottesville, Albemarle, Orange, Buckingham, Louisa, Fluvanna. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, why are we so Civil War, focus on Civil War when we had Jefferson Revolution, Madison, Monroe. And so, yeah, I'm pushing the fact that we got to educate, especially the next generation coming, that they know that there was men and women dealing with the Revolutionary War. It's just not, there's a couple that are known throughout Central Virginia, like Sherrard Goins and Zachary Battles and things like that. But just in Albemarle County alone, I've got 15 that are deemed as patriots. I don't even know if the families know, so working, that's a side project, but it's just like, there needs to be some acknowledgement of that. And we're also talking about some freedom in that as well.
Absolutely. And Shelley, you set up beautifully what my next question was going to be was, there's so much we don't know, you just said. So is there a story or an individual or something that, is an unknown or little known story, or that you think everyone listening to this should walk away with and know?
Well, I'm going to start it off with a quote, and it's by Benjamin Quarles. He said, "The Negro's role in the revolution can be best understood by realizing that his major loyalty was not to be a place nor to a people, but to a principle." And I think that speaks volumes. And I read a book by Judith Buskirk, and she talks about Thomas Lively down in Petersburg. And this man went through, and you're smiling, Emmanuel, so I hope you know about him, because I would love to sing praises on him. And I think the government owes him some medals. But this man was shot, in prison, shot more than once and all this, and still survived. And his name is Thomas Lively from Petersburg area. And I think about, the family had wrote a letter to the government at, seeking information. It's about in the 1930s or whatever. Yeah, 1936. And they were asking about his service. And they responded back to him and telling all the things that happened to him. And it was like, all right, so where's the medals? Where's the thank you for your service? And so that's one person that sticks in my mind a lot. And then I think of, just who's in the boat with Washington. And I call it that when I talk about that. There's a African-American man that's in that boat. Who's talking about him? I know there was some dedication, and there's a woman supposedly in the boat when they're crossing the Delaware. So I think, there's opportunity for more education, and I'll look to Emmanuel because he educates continually. I'm pushing it hard for Central Virginia, and I have a little goal that in every county there should be a marker that recognizes the Revolutionary War and the people of color that contributed. And I'm not going to leave out the women that either dressed up as a man, they're pregnant, they're hauling their babies with them, and are on the front line and not just on the back line being nurses or cooks. There's women that's documented that have fought. We got double agents, and the folks know about James Armstead or James Lafayette, and he took on the Lafayette name because he became a spy and was friends with Marquis de Lafayette. And he was getting stuff, and telling the British stuff to the Americans per se, and in exchange and stuff. So, he did good. And he's one of the reasons they credit him why we won Yorktown for the American Revolution. So again, do the children know about him? My children know, because I pushed it on them once I learned about it, but they're adults now. But I just think there's so many opportunities. And the biggest thing is to emphasize, well, what battles were they part of? Because people might know about battles, but they might not know about individuals as much. So I'll pass it off to Emmanuel.
Yeah, perfect. Emmanuel, what's an untold story or something that hasn't been shared that we should be sharing?
There's so many. Which one? I'll go with one that is it's interesting. It's complicated because of local politics. And so, who you vote for matters, even at the local level. On September 29th, 1864, U.S. General Benjamin Butler, for anyone that may have some sort of interest in the Civil War, may know Butler as sort of a contemporary to us and contemporary in the Civil War. People did not find him physically attractive, but he's really a smart person. And there's a new biography about Butler, and it's on my reading list, but I've vowed I can't buy any more books until I read the stack of like Tower of Pisa books that are falling down all over my house. But Elizabeth Leonard is the author, and everyone I know who's read it says that it should change people's opinions about Butler from this lost cause version of oppressing white women in New Orleans who disrespected United States soldiers and the American flag, to, he was a bumbling battlefield idiot, to understanding Butler, who is complicated in and of itself, a man who supported Jefferson Davis as the nominee for the Democratic Party, whole party, before they broke up in factions in 1860 political election, to Benjamin Butler, who on September 29th, 1864, decides to lead or have part of his army be involved with a battle that will see United States colored troops moving out first. The Battle of New Market Heights, which is in Henrico County, just east of Richmond. And the battle is horrible, really, for a lot of the US colored troops. In the process of the fighting, there are 13 men who are going to do services that are sort of above and beyond, be recognized for that, first by Benjamin Butler. That irritated the War Department in Washington, and ultimately these men are going to receive medals of honor. And so the information about the Battle of New Market Heights, it's been around since the Civil War. Our contemporary acknowledgement of this group of Black men all in one time, and there's only 26 Black men who receive a Medal of Honor for their Civil War service. And if half of them are in one battle, why don't we know more about it? Why is this not something that just pops into our brain when we think about Civil War? We think about Civil War, there's white Confederate soldiers, there's white Union soldiers, Abraham Lincoln's in there. They shoot at each other for 4 years because they are like too dumb to recognize that this isn't how you should fight a war. And war ends and slavery is over. General sort of American knowledge, most likely about the Civil War. Gettysburg is sort of often considered a turning point. I disagree. That's a different conversation. But what about this battle in Henrico County, Virginia? And US colored troops break through the Confederate defenses. We have these men receiving the nation's, one of its highest honors. And over the last, what's this here? Let's just say over the last decade or so, the American Battlefield Trust, previously the Civil War Preservation Trust, has purchased land that has preserved parts of the New Market Heights battlefield. Henrico County has acquired land that's also related to this battlefield. There's ongoing development pressures in this part of Henrico County because it's very close to the city of Richmond. But there seems to be a local political will to not allow public access to the battlefield. And so it's hard to get to this place. You have to sort of know where it is. It's not really well marked on where it is. A friend of mine has a Civil War Trails sign that's nearby to where the US colored troops and other white troops were moving to attack. But if you wanted to sort of experience the place, you got to know the right people that'll let you in on the day that you've arranged it. And so I bring this up because, you know, as I talk about it and as I think to what I do, what my passion was that led me to going to Mary Washington for preservation, it's like, if you want a story to be told, first you have to put in the work to know what the story is, and then you have to work to preserve the place. And too often, you know, I hear people say, you know, we don't know such and such. And it's like, well, what have we done to make it so that people can access that information? What have we done to make it accessible to get to that place? And, you know, this is a very, you know, contemporary relationship, but I just came back from Cleveland this weekend. And I went to the place in the park where Tamir Rice was killed in 2014. And before I went, a friend of mine who's from Ohio was like, hey, just to let you know, the gazebo where that happened, where he actually died, is gone. It's been moved elsewhere. There seemed to be some, you know, contemporary discussion at the time from Rice's mother that she didn't want the gazebo preserved at this place. And I have no children. I'm not a mother. I cannot speak for how she felt. I am not trying to do that. I want to be very clear about that. But it becomes harder for people to have the emotional reactions that we want, the good, bad, and the ugly, the proud moments of military service and decoration in the face of an enemy that is very clear. Confederate soldiers are very clear that they were upset and angered by the presence of US colored troops at the Battle of New Market Heights, to those agonizing moments for contemporary society where a Black child is killed in a park. And now there is a memorial being developed with sort of flowers and a walkway that has his name there. But there was something that, for me, as a person that wants to preserve, that I wanted the gazebo. I needed to have the thing to touch, even though I watched it on the news and I, you know, saw this happening in real life. And thinking about in, you know, 20, 30 years, there'll be people who like have no idea who this kid was. And what is it that are the tangibles that we can sort of get to that. And so I think about that, you know, in the world in which I inhabit, in the Civil War world, where so much land has been developed, that we really owe it to ourselves and the future to make sure that we have done the research about the stories, because there are so many, and that we demand that there is access to the place so we can understand.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Zann, shedding light on stories that people don't know about. I feel like you are in the business of sharing stories about stories.
I like to think that I am, and I'm going to dip into some of the notes I made about the preliminaries of the establishments of the United States colored troops during the Civil War, because one of the things in doing the research about the people who were born in a particular county and then enlisted in United States Colored Troops. And you can track them. And I can, if I have a chance, I can get into all that information later. But though I've done from King George County to Rappahannock and everything in between, I want to focus, because you're talking about stories that are untold or unknown in the wider circles. I cited 4 people as an example of the kind of information you can pull out from doing these studies, and they're all from Orange County. And my premise in talking about people, I'm not quite, Emmanuel, I'm not quite as passionate as you are about place, although I do think it's really important. I am more passionate about people and their deeds, and I don't think that you are not, but sometimes place is not available for a lot of people. So anyway, I found it very interesting, these 4, the records that you look at will give place of birth. They give a lot of data, if you will, on the men. They do not tell you where they are living when they enlist, which is unfortunate. However, they do give the place of enlistment, which causes brains like Shelley and Emmanuel's and mine to go berserk. So Qualls Tibbs was born in Orange County, Virginia, at a place that is still in existence just outside of the town. He enlisted in a county in Ohio, Ross County, Ohio. Now I'm going to come back to Qualls in a second. I don't know a lot about the next 3. I don't know a lot about them yet, but they are worthy of research and study. John Spots, Philip Miner, and Frank Taylor, all born in Orange County, Virginia. But the interesting thing is they all enlisted in Mississippi. Now that screams an obvious answer to me, but it still needs to be checked out. It also, you've got these places where the Union Army has come in and they've basically conquered the area, and Vicksburg was one of them, and they set up refugee camps, and the refugee camps became recruitment centers. So could these people have chosen not to enlist? Absolutely, they could have. But they did enlist, and I think their stories should be written about and commemorated, just as we commemorate any other veteran of the United States of America. And that's a path I'm on now. But let me come back quickly to Qualls Tibbs. Because I did follow Qualls Tibbs. Qualls Tibbs was manumitted in the will of his slaveholding mistress when he was 10 years old, and she manumitted about 70 people. Not all of her enslaved people, but about 70. And I have tracked many of them, and the stories are pretty amazing. And as many of you all know, manumitting someone in Virginia was not just a snap of the fingers. You had to prove to the court that there was funds to remove them within 12 months from the state, or they could petition to stay, and some did, but pretty rarely. So at 10 years old, Qualls Tibbs leaves with his mother and some siblings and a lot of other people from Orange, and they moved to Ross County, Ohio. When the Civil War breaks out, he enlists in an Ohio unit. Now, I haven't gotten to the really remarkable part yet, but I've done a lot of study of the first African-American troops who engaged. They were the predecessors, Emmanuel, to the Newmarket battle. They crossed the Rappahannock in early 1864 with the Union Army, then proceeded on to cross the Rapidan. They came into the Wilderness Battle a few days after it had moved sort of south. However, Qualls-Tibbs was in the units of African-American soldiers who crossed the Rappahannock into Culpeper County and then back into Orange, where he had previously been enslaved. And the rules at that time from the Confederacy was that if you found a Black man in a blue uniform, you could execute him on the spot. And we know that there were 3 of those soldiers who we don't know who they were. It was not Qualls-Tibbs, who indeed were executed after crossing the Rappahannock and marching to the Rapidan. And that's documented information. So I've written about Qualls-Tibbs. He is noted in the new museum in Washington. He went back home to Ross County. He raised a family. He owned a little farm. He was very prosperous. He rose to the rank of corporal. And I think it's a fantastic story. A man of courage who made the decision to go back to where he had fortunately escaped. So that's my guy, but I think that we need to look at the other 3 I mentioned, not that we don't need to look at the other 90 some odd just from Orange and find out what their stories were. But I think it's pretty clear that if you're born in Orange, Virginia, and you enlist 25 years later in Mississippi, that somebody either carried you south or sold you south.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows, maybe they were seeking a way to come back home.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I would contribute.
That's fantastic. I think that that's really interesting, and thinking about, these names and how do we make some of these names as common and these places and these battles as common in the language as Abraham Lincoln and Gettysburg. How do we, or George Washington and Yorktown, how do we bring these names and places and battles that have been taken out of the conversation?
I think there are lots of ways, and Emmanuel has mentioned some of them. When you preserve that battlefield, or you put up a monument, or these men posthumously get the Medal of Honor and they're written about. But there's so many, like he said, there are so many stories of human courage and character that have gone by the wayside. Does it mean we can't revive them? I think we can, and I think people would like to know their stories. And that gets into a little bit more about what I was talking about, but certainly if they filed for a pension, we can learn a lot more about who they were.
Well, can you expand a little bit on, because there may be a lot of folks on this call that want to do research about either their own family members or their, own communities, the people from their communities. So what kinds of things can you learn from these records, and where should people be looking?
Oh, and what was the last part of that question?
What kinds of things can folks learn from these records, and where should they be looking?
Okay. And you want me to kick that off?
Yeah, why don't you kick it off, Zann, and then we'll go.
You want me to kick that off?
Yes, Zann, why don't you start? You're there.
And that's fine. There's a tremendous amount of information. Interestingly enough, there's so much of a void of documentation about African Americans in our country. There is a wealth of information on it's a subscription-based data source called Fold 3. They have all the military records, and actually Ancestry.com also does, because I think they bought Fold 3, but of those who served in the United States colored troops. And I want to put something in here right now, because I want other people that started taking on something I started taking on. I am trying not to use the term United States colored troops, what is more important and what today people in 2022 need to understand is that these are United States military veterans. When they fought for the United States of America. They signed an oath of allegiance to protect the United States of America. And we don't honor them in our communities. People don't know who they are. In Culpeper, we've identified at least 116, and occasionally that number bumps up. In Orange, we've identified 95 people. Anyway, so these military records, and you can go to your libraries, I'm sure, or borrow somebody else's subscription. It takes a little bit of navigating. They've changed some things around, but if you filter the search, for example, to a county, you can put in Orange County, or you can put in Louisa or Spotsylvania, and the state, of course. They will populate a list of men who were born in that place, and some information about them. If you go to fold 3 and you seek that that same person, knowing their regiment, and you get that from the initial search. Some of the information you get is a place of birth, place of enlistment, their age at the time of enlistment. And I found that curious because I found one fellow who was in his 50s. I think that may be the oldest person I found. But anyway, their complexion, their eye color, their hair color. It also will provide their occupation and their assigned regiment and company. Then in fold 3, you can track them through these muster rolls. And the thing that's important about that, and that's how I figured out who was where when they were crossing the Rappahannock, is the muster rolls will show you where that individual, if that individual was present, and Emmanuel could probably speak to this better than I, but if that person during a period of time, like for the month of May in 1864, was that person present, absent? And if they're absent, often they'll give a reason. Sometimes that reason is speculation and not accurate. But then if you look at the regiment and say, okay, well, where were they in battle? Or, were they at the Wilderness? And you're looking at these guys were present. So they were crossing the river at that time. You can, the idea that these 3 men born in Orange but enlisted in Mississippi, it tells you something else. That they were either relocated by their owners or they were sold by their owners. Now, it just all these clues, and Shelley is the quintessential genealogist, but all these clues go into helping you figure out perhaps who owned them. And it's typically getting into the white records that help you learn more about our African-American ancestors. The other place I would highly recommend, and in fold 3, a lot of times it'll tell you whether there was a pension filed either by a dependent, by the individual themselves, or by a widow. And that's a little more laborious and a little less accessible because you have to either go to the National Archives and pull those papers, or you have to pay somebody to do that. But it's chock full of information about their life after the war, because they have to prove that they were injured. They have to get other people to write testimonials for them. They have to have a doctor to write a testimonial. If it's a widow, she has to prove she didn't marry somebody else and that she was really married to him. And so you get all kinds of people feeding into that information, which again is a lot of clues. So there isn't as much information available, say for if somebody had an ancestor who fought in the Confederate Army, there's not as much information available. The Union Army kept a lot better records. So I'll stop there because I know Manuel has something else to add to that kind of thing.
Well,
And
I
I'm
know.
going to add also after Emmanuel.
Well, one of the things I do want to say before we go to Emmanuel and to Shelley is when you take those trips to the National Archives, and one of the things that I think is really powerful is that any of us can go to the National Archives and sit down and look at those documents and hold them and touch them and read them for ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
And
make copies.
And make
copies. Either you can take pictures or have them make copies. And I would say this, Mary, and I know I'm interrupting you, I apologize. It's best to have that pension file number before you go. It shortens the time frame.
Absolutely. I just am always struck by that because many years ago, I used to take high school students to the National Archives to do research. And I remember a young man saying to me, well, these are just copies, right? And I said, no, these are the real documents. And he was blown away that he was trusted enough to handle and look at documents that happen to be Civil War documents we were looking at. And he was a young man who wasn't a scholar. He wasn't an A student. He wasn't, a star in anything. And I think he was a young man who had not been trusted most of his life. And the fact that he was trusted to do that was very empowering. And so it always reminds me that that is something that we all, whether we have degrees in history or whatever, have a right to do. But I just wanted to put that down. And let's go to Emmanuel if you want to add some stuff, and then Shelley, you can bring us home as the family tree girl.
Well, Mary, I'm going to shift what I'm going to say because of what you just ended with. The National Archives is one of the most important repositories in the United States of America. And there's been a lot of sort of contemporary, it is a part of the government. So the government has to support the National Archives. We, the people, need to do more to demand that the politicians do more to support that institution. Because within that institution, a lot of what Mary just highlighted about this one individual student from years ago is reflected in the widows' pensions that Zann referenced, and in the soldiers' pensions. One of the things that perhaps we should just say, if you don't know, it was not a requirement that it was not a requirement that white people carried around any identification with them prior to or during or after the Civil War. There's no driver's license, there's no photo ID, you didn't have to carry around a birth certificate, you just went about, you said who you were, and people believed you. The more political and social and economic power you had, the more people knew who you were and just knew that you were who you said you were. Enslaved people had to carry around passes written legally, authorized by the person who claimed to own them. And of course, there's a whole group of people who are forging passes for these folks to do all sorts of things, including finding their way to freedom. Free Black people, like my ancestors, had to carry around papers identifying that they were free. When Black folks enlisted in these US colored troop regiments and these state regiments that followed the same system of white officers and Black non-commissioned officers and enlisted men during the Civil War, they were not issued anything that was required by the US government that any other United States soldier would have identification with them. We think of dog tags as information that's really detailed. They do dental records and all sorts of photographing. We have many more ways to communicate today. So if people like go missing, it's like, okay, I didn't hear from this person because they call me every day at the same time, no matter where they are and what they're doing. This just wasn't present during the Civil War. And so Mary's story about the trust that this child was experiencing is frequently not represented in the trust that the United States gave to Black widows, particularly present for Black widows. Black women who have lost their husband as their husband, whether they willingly enlisted, were a substitute for a white soldier, or were forced by recruiting men to serve, had given their life for the United States, and through their service had preserved places to have supplies, to fight in battles, to keep hospitals safe, to protect prisoner of war camps where US soldiers are guarding Confederate prisoners. And so we see cases where the trust isn't there. And so Black women have to run through a lot more hurdles, get a lot more people together to identify, yes, I was married to this person. The reason that you don't have a certificate should be obvious, because the United States didn't issue any marriage certificates to Black folks. Local government and state government didn't issue marriage certificates to Black people. Getting one from a church was not always that easy, depending on where you live. And if you were free, because enslaved people didn't get one no matter what. But what Zann pointed out a moment ago is also true. Within particularly these widows' pension records, they have to go and face the people often who once enslaved them, or their family members, and say, they trust the same people who a year, 3 years, 15 years, 25 years, 40 years ago, the same government I'm trying to get a pension from was fighting your son, your cousin, your husband. Now they only trust you to say that, remember when you enslaved me and my husband and we got married in 1850 in the front parlor at your house? I need you to go tell them that. And there are so many episodes of like local gossip and like, this person that you've been providing a pension to is actually running a house of ill repute. And all it takes is one busybody neighbor to report this, and your whole pension case could be reopened, and you have to sort of relitigate this information all over again. And the further you get from the Civil War, let's say you got a pension from 1865 until 1880, now your case is being reopened. All those people that have died since then, that could have been your testimonial, and you're going to have to like find the next generation of testimonials, or new people who have moved in and have known that you were a widow and have talked to you for the last 20 years and you said you were a widow, even though they never knew your husband, and they don't know any of these other people that you were once enslaved by, or that you were a free person you live next to. They can be really eye-opening and really tragic for people who end up losing their pension, and in some cases getting it back, but it taking years for that to happen.
Mary, I know Shelley wants to talk, but I want to pick up on something that Emmanuel just said about pensions, because number one, the pensions didn't start coming forward until like 20 years after the Civil War was over, it seems like. But there was a federal law that said that if somebody was filing a pension claim, they could use advocates. Usually attorneys, but those advocates could not charge them more than I'm going to make up a number and say this is 18 for not a simple thing. And anybody trial even today, a governmental form, there's not very simple.
Hey,
There's a
Zann.
fellow in Culper who was born in Louisa, but was to Culper.
Hey, Zann, you're breaking up pretty bad right now. So I think most of us didn't catch what you just said. And now Emmanuel looks sad about it. So I'm going to let Shelley go, and hopefully your internet's going to sort itself out.
No, it's not my internet. I was muted.
Oh, no, you were breaking up
No.
before.
No, you were breaking up. Yeah. Well, I'm going to give resources for both of what they said. And first, I want to comment when she mentioned Fold 3. And I did put in the chat that 95% of the American Revolutionary War records are on Fold 3. We're talking about millions. Now I'm going to switch to the USCTs. Well, let me talk about the USCT. So one of the beautiful things on Fold 3 is that you got that these I'm going to say slaveholders could free their enslaved and allow them to go fight on the Union side. Now, what they had to do, and I'm talking about resources and records now, this is on Fold 3. So they had to prove first that they owned that individual, the person that was enslaved, and I'm going to say John Smith. So they had to come forth with a certificate of title. You've got a collection of those on Fold 3. And what's really fascinating about that is you can go in and look and say, Johnny Reb is going to free John Smith. Here's my proof that I owned him, which could also say who he purchased him from, get you back another generation. But the ultimate goal for them to do that was $300. So they got $300 basically from the Union if they allowed their formerly enslaved person to fight. So that's one thing, which is a great genealogy find, is to be able to track in those areas and find those. And they're either proof of ownership. I've seen them called certificate of title, but again, chock full of information. The other thing I want to talk about in reference to both of the things that they said are the communications that USCTs had with their families. And I know Annie is here, and I referenced the website Valley of the Shadow. That, according to Dr. Ed Ayers, and this was a few years ago, that might be the largest collection of letters and diaries from USCTs on that site. And that site, Valley of the Shadow, is comparing Franklin County, Pennsylvania, and Augusta County, Virginia. And so it's worth looking. They're looking at the two counties and everything before the war, during the war, and after the war. But again, the brilliant thing there is the collections of the letters. And all of you probably have just seen of the ancestry, the dream letters about Hawkins Wilson, and my friend Nika was the genealogist there. And again, you heard him going to my favorite collection, which is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Refugees are white, formerly enslaved are the freedmen. Okay, so don't think it's just a Black collection. It is also a collection that has everybody in it because number one, it's federal. So we just call it the Bureau or the Freedmen's Bureau. In the Freedmen Bureau, part of their charge was to support and take care of, say, the USCTs, be it any kind of claim they had or bounty pay or back pay, this, that, and the other. They could go to those field offices throughout the South, and you can go to mapping the Freedmen's Bureau .org, I think it is, and be able to go to the Freedmen's Bureau, right in through Family Search to the Bureau to be able to look at these records. And another thing I want to point out, and some of you probably know, Angela Watton-Raji, she does a presentation, and Emmanuel and Zann talked about pensions, and another person, Bernice Bennett, did several years on the widows' pensions at the National Archives. Another person, there's several talks on her Blog Talk radio show about widows' pensions. But the thing that Angela found, and I want to say it was in the Bureau records, the Freedmen Bureau records, where the nurses and the cooks and things actually got pensions. So don't think they didn't get some. You got to go find, and she found a collection, and she's going to be doing some presentations on that. So that's a great opportunity to find that out. But the Bureau, number one, realized that that's right after the war ends. There's a couple states that got field offices and services are open before or pre-Bureau, field offices and services, and that's Mississippi, Louisiana, and actually Fort Monroe, Virginia. They have pre-Bureau records. And again, everybody is in these records. It's not just USCTs, freedmen, formerly enslaved, you got whites in there. So if you're looking through that period of, say, 1861, to the end of the Civil War, to get names, locations, and slaveholders the slaveholders who are hiring their formerly enslaved under labor contracts, or even people that are going for ration records. If I could just focus on Virginia, but I'm going to say one little story of an amazing thing in this Bureau records, and it was a ration record. And we were looking at this ration record, and there was a lady named Betsy. Betsy had a surname, and it also in the ration record said Betsy's applying for rations, who her last slave owner was. So we got the date of 1867. Betsy was 100 years old. Think about that. That record was made in 1867. And again, we talk about all these different things regarding during slavery, pre-slavery, after slavery, but we're talking about people, and there's a story, and you got 100-year-old, which this is not uncommon, but number one, think about it. She was born before this country was the United States. We don't know if that slave owner listed in that record was she enslaved with that person her whole 100 years, or did she get off of the boat and get sold from Africa? She's born 1767. And then again, does her family know? We're talking about the stories and how do we get this information? Does her family even know she existed? Have they gotten back that far to know? And actually, there's a group of folks that took that on as a case study to find out. And she's just one small example, but that's a woman. Was she a mother? Is she a grandmother, a third great grandmother, this, that, and other? So the Freedmen Bureau, I think, is definitely not a resource to miss if we're talking about, number one, United States colored troops. Fold 3 is not a resource to look at, because even for the Revolutionary War, they've got the British records as well as the United States records. The Confederate records are also on Ancestry and Fold 3. And what was the other thing? I think that was it. And then I talked about Valley. I was trying to give out those resources, the Valley of the Shadow. It is worth reading those letters, just like you heard Hawkins Wilson trying to find his sisters. This is what you'll see in those letters on that Valley of the Shadow site. And so I would encourage folks to just start asking questions and find these resources that we mentioned today. And yeah, NARA's a great place. That's the place to go when they're open and we can come in there and get in there and get those records. If not, look at Family Search, Ancestry, and Fold 3, especially for military. And I'll hush after all of that.
Oh no, you're perfect. We have a few questions in the chat, and I
Okay.
also want to invite the audience members, if they have other questions, to go ahead and add them. I think you touched on the first question that was asking about resources, and we just talked about that quite a lot. And then there was a question about Benjamin Davis. Emmanuel, this prompts a question I have. While Benjamin Davis was the first African-American general in the US military, does anyone know who was the first to become an officer that led men? Like, who was the first lieutenant? I don't know if any of you all know that, if Emmanuel, if you know that.
So I can't speak for pre-Civil War, but mainly because it's not really authorized by the US government to have Black men serving, even though Black men served in the American Revolution, War of 1812, in wars against Native Americans, in wars that they joined Native people against the United States and other colonial powers that are still in the United States in the early 19th century. But during the Civil War, some of the first Black officers that will be leading men on the battlefield include Andre Caillou, who was born in Louisiana. He was an early war member of the Louisiana Native Guard. This unit has like a very misremembered history of the Civil War as being for contemporary people who like to believe that the Confederacy was not fighting to preserve the institution of slavery. They will say, oh, the first Louisiana Guard, they were, Black Confederate soldiers. That's not true. Please do not believe that that is true. You will
Ooh, I'm going to give you an amen on that. And I'm going to repeat what he said. It is not true.
This is a very quick way to make people angry, like Shelley and I are getting angry. Caillou, once Butler has occupied New Orleans in 1862, will become an officer in the United States Army. Caillou will give his life serving the United States in Louisiana in 1863. His body is brought back to New Orleans. It's a huge funeral for him in New Orleans, one of the largest ever for a Black person, certainly at that time in New Orleans. Contemporary to him, P.S. Pinchbeck, who will later go on to become a member of post-war Louisiana's government. Pinchbeck is also a field officer in this unit that had been the Louisiana Native Guard and becomes a part of the United States military during the Civil War. In total, there are only about 100 Black officers during the Civil War. Most of them are not going to be leading troops on the battlefield, which makes Caillou and Pinchbeck interesting. Plus, there's a lot more known about them. But they're also going to be kind of unique because the US government, even in the aftermath of the Civil War, is still not, gung-ho about Black military men becoming officers. It gets to what Zann pointed out earlier. What are the freedoms? Now, okay, we're done with slavery, but you still think that, we're not good enough to serve this nation in all of its glory. And I would be remiss if I didn't say a couple of other things that just because, and not that the question suggested this, but just to be clear, lots of non-commissioned officers end up leading the men around them because during the Civil War, lots of white officers get shot, killed, and it's the non-commissioned officers who are left behind. That's a lot of the men at the Battle of New Market Heights. It's the situation at Petersburg, the battlefield where I worked, Battle of the Crater in July of 1864. Non-commissioned officer Decatur Dorsey will gather the American flag and rally men around him when their officers are gone. And when he realized the battle was not going in the direction of a federal victory, he runs this flag back across this battlefield with artillery shells hurling through the air, bullets still going around, wounded people all around him, and will rally the men around him once he's gotten back into the safety of the Union lines. And for that, Dorsey will receive a Medal of Honor. It is important, I think, to recognize that those non-commissioned officers have unique relationships with the men that they are sort of second in command of, but relate to in many ways more than the white officers who actually command the units. And I know that my president of my fan club is here. And so if you are interested in a post-war officer who serves into the 20th century, who will be leading Black soldiers as they patrol national parks, please read about Colonel Charles Young. And you can now visit his home in Ohio, which is a part of the National Park Service system. And he is an interesting person because his sort of trajectory in the military service is directly related to his family's decision to get away from slavery. His father joins the U.S. Colored Troop Regiment, and Young, like so many other Black folk, see a future in the post-Civil War South, post-Civil War United States, post-Civil War world as something that he can contribute to within the military.
Mary,
Oh,
I know that we're getting very short on time, and I just wanted to put something out there that would call for a follow-up virtual presentation. We have talked a lot about the service of African Americans in this country from the time it was formed, loyal to this country, even though the country was not loyal to them. And I think there's a whole nother part that people need to understand, whether it was in the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. African Americans and other minorities, but particularly we're talking about African Americans, rose to the occasion every single time. They were not treated well. And I think, Emmanuel, you could speak to, particularly at the disaster that happened at St. Pay. They were right. Look at the men who said that Tuskegee Airmen would never make it as any value during World War II. And those are the histories also that people need to understand, that these men and women kept coming back, kept serving this country, that kept putting them down. But they did it for a reason. And we are bit by bit telling those stories, but we all need to engage in telling more of those stories. And real quickly, Orange has celebrated the life of Captain Andrew Maples, who served as a Tuskegee Airman during World War II. His plane went down over Italy. They never recovered his plane or his body. He was declared dead, I think, in 1945, missing in 44. Last year, thanks to a wonderful judge, we commissioned a portrait of Captain Maples to be placed in the circuit courtroom in the Orange County court system. We had an event. I asked the local VFW to come and simply present the colors. They said, we want to do more. They gave this man full military honors. And when I was explaining to his sister what was going to happen, I got a really strange kind of response from her. And it didn't dawn on me until the next day. And I called her back. Her name is Mrs. Walker. And I said, Mrs. Walker, I know you never had the body, but did you ever have in 1945, did you ever have a ceremony for your brother? And she said, I'm sorry, this is really hard for me to relate without being emotional. She said, they never gave us any ceremony in 1945. This day, last May in 2021, was the first time this man was honored publicly with taps, with a 21-gun salute, with a presentation of the American flag to his family. And they said, not only was it a wonderful event, but it brought closure. Finally, after all these years, they brought closure to the family. These are the things we need to work on, and we need to understand that Black people, Native people, Asian people have fought for this country's freedoms and not been treated well or recognized. I'm sorry. I just wanted to get that out there. We can have another presentation.
Well, I think that is a wonderful and beautiful thing. And for those of you who saw the advertisement for this program, that is a picture of Captain Maples. So I'm so happy that you were able to share his story. I know we're running short of time, but I want to give Shelley one chance because she's been answering a little bit. We talked about the Civil War, we talked about the 20th century, but let's kind of kick it back a little bit, kind of before the Civil War. Was there anything that you wanted to share? You made notes about 1812 and the revolution sort of in the chat, but is there anything you wanted to share sort of orally with the
No,
group?
just for your first question that came out to all of us.
Right.
There's some, I just put in 5,000 some slaves took their chances during the War of 1812. It could be more. You've got up to 7,000 when we're talking about Rev War. And we didn't even talk about the 20,000 during the Black Loyalists who basically were enticed and promised their freedom if they would fight for the British. Didn't happen. Not everybody got their freedom. But there's just, again, and I think all of us have communicated, there's so much out there that we don't know, even though you know what we've shared, things that we studied. I made myself, write a book. You're going to have to make these people known, and if nothing else, that information will be out, just like they honored Captain Maples. I'm saying we need to get these names out because you know what? No different than anybody else. They bled the same. They fought the same. They provided a service the same, and need to be recognized also. And we're talking about military and the whole situation across the whole country about monuments and stuff. And there's only about 3 or 4 monuments for Gold Star mothers and families. And I think that's something people need to think about also, because that's one common thing that every family, regardless of what shade you show up as, there is loss of somebody military wise somewhere from the day this country started, basically, and coming forward. And those families need to be honored, just as well as looking at the actual individual, but some of those that go through the loss of someone during wartime and this, that, and other. So I just want to say thank you for inviting us, to talk on this. The military is definitely my thing. I'm like Emmanuel. I got Rev War, he's got USCT and stuff. And I'm going to connect you with Angela, because we found a record set where these nurses and these cooks and things got pensions. And we about freaked out looking and thinking, wait a minute, nobody told us about this. But again, another hidden gem that's sitting out there that's not being shared. So she's going to start doing talks on that, but that's a whole nother part, and we talk about even World War I and World War II, and we're talking a couple million, during those later wars and things. And, like World War II, there was 2.5 million African Americans. Did they get treated right? No.
Mhm.
But that's a tradition, and you look at it. So I just want to thank you, because I get a chance to talk about military as a military spouse, ex-spouse now, but love it and enjoyed it. So, and thank you for Zann and Emmanuel for being here,
Well-
because I definitely love talking about the military.
I'm going to hold you all to Zann's idea of maybe doing
Yes.
a part 2. We'll give ourselves a little bit of a break. And I think this is such a big and amazing conversation. And there are so many names and stories and places that you all have talked about that for those of us that live in the Piedmont, that live in Central Virginia, like that all of a sudden we can understand the place where we live better. And for those of you who aren't, in the audience that aren't from the local area, thinking about their hometowns, their home counties, their home regions. What are the name? Who are the Captain Maples of where they're from? Who, what's the Battle of Newmarket that hasn't been talked about, that's in somebody else's hometown? And I think that there's just so much to still be discovered and to be shared, and really seeing, as Zann and Emmanuel also really connected really beautifully, both of them, the connection of what has happened in the past still is affecting us every day. It's affecting our daily lives, and maybe directly through family members or as we experience places or our work and how we understand the world. And I think for those of you who haven't been part of this series of conversations, if you go back and listen to some of the past conversations, I think you'll see these same themes showing up again, whether we're talking about the military or we're talking about food or we're talking about music. Or family stories. These same themes are showing up in all of these conversations and showing, kind of making a much more, not only a more complete understanding of African American history, but really a more complete understanding of American history, because you can't take the African out of American history. You can't remove that. It's so embedded in our culture and who we are as people. So I just want to thank each of you so much for your time, for your thoughts, for sharing it with all of us, and the amazing amount of resources that you shared with us. And I will be calling or emailing you to get the gang back together and continue this conversation. So thanks again, and thank you to everyone in the audience that has joined us. If you know somebody that's missed it, we will be putting the recording online sometime this week, and I'll be sharing that with everyone. So thank you again to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.